Down to the Wire podcast. We have reached the final of Euro 2020. Dav, back with us again. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Jack. Glad that we've got one more game to go.
One more game to go. One more game to talk about. We're going to be talking about the route to the final as well. And obviously, Jack, how you doing?
You know what? Well, I was going to say on a philosophical level, but it's not really a philosophical answer I'm going to give. I'm not as good as I usually am. I'm not as good, if I'm honest. Because I really just want England to lose at some point. Call me salty, just want them to lose. But yeah, and
and we had the devastating loss of Ukraine as well.
We did. To be honest, life's gone downhill from that point. Yeah, you're right.
Jack, we want people to continue listening from this point.
I'm gonna have to find a new underdog to root for, I think, in some sport.
But okay, fair enough. As I said, we're into the final. We have our finalists, Italy and England. With, I guess, in some ways they've both got a bit to prove. As in Italy, the past couple of international tournaments have been
absent.
Absent or struggling. Not exactly, considering they won the World Cup in 2006. They've not really been anywhere close to that sort of thing until now. And obviously England haven't won anything for a long time.
50 years before that.
Yeah, so... however long it is. So, it's going to be an interesting game regardless. But before we get into that game specifically, I guess do kind of like a brief overview of the tournament as we're kind of entering the final stage, aren't we? So, anyone have any highlights from the tournament?
I'll go with my highlight was Monday the 28th of June.
That's very specific.
I'm sure you'll remember where you all were. That was the day that Spain beat Croatia 5-3, and then France were 3-1 up. They were 1-0 down against the Swiss. They went 3-1 up. The Swiss brought it back to 3-3, and then the Swiss won 5-4 on penalties. That was, I would say, the best day of football, for entertainment anyway, in the tournament. There was a lot going on.
That's not a bad shout, actually.
Would you specifically say just for this tournament? Or how broad would you say that day in particular was as good as?
Well,
in terms of football,
I would say certainly for the tournament.
Yeah.
I can't say that I've got a record of all
Every
days of football that have ever been.
I thought after you listed the day, I thought, he's clearly got a set list of days in his diary that he really liked.
No, it was a fortnight ago. I think that's why that one's still fresh in the mind. But for entertainment and for to be fair, you could say there's been higher games of quality in as far as players on the pitch and what they've done. Like there was a bit of scrapping around with some of the goals, but still, for entertainment, for games swinging one way and another, because I think in that Croatia-Spain game, Croatia went 1-0 up. Then Spain were 3-1 up, went to 3-3 extra time, 5-3, like just a lot of entertainment.
And wasn't there 2 goals for the 3-3 element? Weren't they both in the 90th minute or something? They were all both like insanely close to the end of the game as well.
Yeah, they were both. They were both towards the end, last 10 minutes or so, and it was the same with the Swiss as well. So as a highlight, I think that was a good day.
Fair enough. Can't argue with that. Jack, what about you?
Well, call me biased, but I have thoroughly enjoyed rooting for the Ukraine throughout this tournament, and the fact that they made it to the knockouts, that was quite a high I was on at that stage because I didn't think they were going to make it through. But to beat Sweden in the 118th minute, that I was ecstatic. So just a high in general for the Ukraine, and sort of coming out and showing off a bit as I predicted. But in terms of on-field performances, truth be told, I mean, what I really love to see in terms of tournaments, you think of, was it Brazil 2014, James Rodriguez as a player announced himself. No players really announced themselves this tournament, but when James Rodriguez scored that outside of the box, half volley or first time volley after a beautiful over the head sort of ball, that was amazing. We haven't really had one of them, so to me, I don't think there's actually been a genuine highlight. I mean, I think someone said the Denmark goal against England last night, from when we were recording this, was the first goal from a free kick in the tournament. So in terms of spectacular goals, there hasn't been a glut of them in a sense. It's by and large been quite teams who beat each other doing quite a lot of tactical approaches, how they break down teams. So that in a sense, I haven't really got a game in my mind or a moment in my mind that's really been the highlight, apart from Ukraine wowing the world. Yeah, that's
fair enough. I think for me, I can't, it would be between either Patrick Schick's goal against Scotland.
Oh, good shot.
Which was like crazy. And not only because of the distance as well, but if you watch the footage from behind the goal, it's miles like outside of the goal, and then he just manages to curl it in. So that was a quality strike. And I think I'm going to kind of steal a little bit of what Dav was saying in terms of the group of death with France, Germany, and Portugal, because I think there was that day where Portugal had filled every single spot within the group. Within the 90 minutes. And I guess in that sense, like Hungary just kind of... Because I think they were very unlucky not to get anything against Portugal in their first game, because they held Portugal out, and then in the last 5 minutes they just kind of crumbled. You know, they managed to put pressure on the other two teams in the group. So, yeah, I think for me it would probably be one of those scenarios, the group of death, or Patrick Schick's screamer. Any shocks from the tournament, do you think?
I tell you what was, I think, quite surprising was the fact that the group of death, the entirety of that group got eliminated before any other group, I think. I think all other groups survived longer than the group of death, which, a bit ironic.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, considering it was labelled the group of death, when you look at how the teams played, I mean, you'd probably say that out of the three, you'd say that Portugal, relative to the talent they have, were probably the worst, I think. You know, as in, like, they just weren't very good at all. And to be fair, Jack, you called this, like you said, Bruno Fernandes just doesn't turn up for Portugal. And he didn't, to the point where they dropped him. You know, you had France, who kind of weren't horrendous, but they kind of weren't great either. They kind of stumbled through the group. And then you had the Germans, who tore Portugal to pieces, but then struggled to beat Hungary. So yeah, it was a bit of a weird group, really, I guess. So group of death by name, but not by nature.
Amen.
So I'd probably agree with you on that one. What about you, Dav?
Well, I'll do two, because one I've already kind of mentioned. I don't think anybody gave the Swiss a chance beating the French, so I think that was certainly a shock, given that France were pre-tournament favourites. And then I think you've got to give a mention to the Czechs as well. They beat the Netherlands 2-0. I don't think anybody gave them a chance in that game. People were quite critical of, you know, that group that England were in with the Czechs, saying, "Oh, it's an easy group." But you know, the Czech Republic have, I think, you know, they've, along with Ukraine, those are the two teams that have probably really outperformed themselves in this tournament, and probably got further than they thought they would. Both play in different ways, but so, you know, I'm sure that some would say, their own fans would say, "Oh, we always knew they could play this well," and both teams aren't easy to break down. But I don't think anybody, given that the Dutch had won all of their group games, I read that no team has ever won all of their group games, topped their group, and then gone out in the last 16 straight away. So that was a surprise, I think. So I think as a shock, then I think you've got to go. I'd pick that result out as a bit of a shocker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I guess going back to what you were saying about England, going off on a little bit of a tangent, but that group was a bit odd, wasn't it? Because I think obviously going into the tournament, you had people saying, you know, like you said, the group was easy, but ultimately, I think out of that group, you know, Scotland gave England a really tough time, particularly at Wembley as well. You know, and really, I think, you know, relative to the expectations, I think Croatia were a massive disappointment, weren't they? As in, England won their first game against Croatia 1-0, and you were kind of looking at it going, okay, they won 1-0, but Croatia just offered absolutely nothing. So, yeah, that's a fair point there, Dan. Fair point. Any other thoughts on the tournament so far? I mean, there's been a little bit of discussion in terms of the distance travelled. I know Wales definitely picked this out because I think they played I think they played Baku. Was it Baku Rome?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be fair, I think a lot of what Wales's issues, they didn't travel the most. The most who travelled was Switzerland.
No,
but I think the big issue for Wales is the pure fact that they couldn't get any fans there. And I think that is what makes international tournaments. You see England, they're 100%. Loving life at the moment because they've played all their games at home. They've had such a great atmosphere there. But when you're off in Baku for 2 games, I've got to break the bank, or you know what I mean. You can't make it.
Well, and there's COVID rules as well.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people, because I think they said basically at one, like they had some. I think for one of the games they had like some Welsh fans in Azerbaijan, but they were there because they lived there. So basically, I think it was kind of like if you're in Baku, either you've been there for like months, or you are breaking COVID rules.
Yeah, this tournament certainly hasn't been for the fans. This tournament's been for whichever teams UEFA wanted to have home games.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I remember when this format was announced years ago, and I remember thinking, what a stupid format. Because it's to celebrate, I think it's like 50 years of the Euros or something like that, some sort of celebration. But even at the time, I remember thinking, as in you're going to have teams like travelling across the continent to play like group matches, not even like going from a group match to a knockout game, like just within the group. They're travelling, like again just for context because we're Welsh, but as in to get from their second group match to their final group match, Wales had to travel nearly 2,000 miles. Like that's just bonkers. But I think particularly in COVID times as well, I really don't understand why they pressed ahead with this kind of tournament format of a continental Euros. I'm sure we've said this before on the podcast, but I don't know. I feel like it kind of. I feel like the Euros hasn't had much identity really. Perhaps I'm saying that perhaps if you're an English fan, you'd argue that it probably has because you've played pretty much all your games at home. But like for Wales, where you feel very detached when your home team is playing 2 games in Baku, 1 game in Rome. So. Bit of a messy one, I think. What are your thoughts, Sav, on the whole kind of travelling and fans and no fans and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, like you've covered the ground well there, Jack. It's. I think the one disappointment. Obviously, people could say, you're Welsh, so you would say this, and it, then that's fair enough. But I think the disappointment is more that all teams weren't kind of on the same equal footing. So you could for example take a look at Group B, which was the group that Belgium were in. So they played all their games in Denmark. Denmark played all their games in Denmark, but Russia was in that group as well. So Belgium played twice in Russia and once in Denmark. So they did over 5,500 miles of travelling. So you have to wonder then, when they are coming up against Italy in the quarterfinals, you got to think, well, if Italy barely travelled anything in comparison, they played all their group games at home. Belgium could be saying the same thing. Like, look, we've travelled thousands of miles here, and Italy, they've not travelled hardly anything. So it doesn't feel like. Therefore, I know we said on the podcast last time, on paper, these players are doing this regularly in the Champions League. It's not a big deal to travel from England out to Italy or to Germany or even out to Ukraine to play a game and then you come back. But I over the course of the season, over the group stages in the Champions League, everybody would do that. Whereas this is, some teams have done a lot of travelling and some teams have done very little. And you wonder, does a Belgium team that have played all their games in Belgium would they have beaten Italy if it was the other way round? Well, you could never say. It's hypothetical, but I think that's the one thing that's a shame. We're all looking forward to Germany 24 when it's all back in one country and everyone's travelling more or less the same amounts, because you want it to be kind of equal going into it, for it to be one less thing to say. And yeah, obviously then that does affect the fans, because we've seen in the Premier League the last year that in as far as home advantage and all that kind of thing, it's kind of decreased massively, because the big teams have gone to the smaller clubs, and whereas in the past you might have quite an intimidating, think of some of the smaller grounds like Burnley, for example. You go away to these small, you go away to these small grounds, and the crowd are not far from
Hostile.
the pitch. Yeah, exactly. So there is something going on there with having fans there, and the fans respond to that. Whereas, we saw it in France in 2016. The Welsh fans, the players would say that they played a part. Well, the fans haven't had the opportunity to play the part this time, and it's just one of those. Don't get me wrong. I don't know who's to say whether having Welsh fans in when we were playing the Danish, would that have made a difference? Who's to say? On paper, Denmark were the better team, and on the day they were the better team. But you never know, could you? And I think that's the frustration. You just think, if we hadn't had to do that travelling, if we could have all had our fans equally, who's to say what could have happened? It's a shame. It's disappointing. But ultimately, Wales, nor Belgium, nor anyone else isn't going to make those excuses. But it's just, I wouldn't be disappointed if we never had this format again, because it's not been ideal, I don't think.
Truth be told, when the format was announced, I wasn't opposed to it, and I'm still not opposed to it. What I am opposed to is certain nations getting all of the easy rides, which I think you sort of mentioned in a way. But what I was hoping from a tournament which kind of was opened up to say loads of nations can host some games, it's an opportunity in particular for the smaller nations to host games, which, you know what I mean, nation like Wales, nation like Ireland, nation like Switzerland, they're never going to host an international tournament. Exactly. They're never going to host an international tournament. So it's an opportunity for those nations to host games. But secondly, just because you host a game doesn't mean you have to be the host. You can have games in Wembley and have England play in a group in Italy. You can have Italy play games in Copenhagen whilst there's still games going on in Italy. You know what I mean? You haven't got to put these nations in their home nation just because they are some games there. It just, as you were saying, it didn't feel like a fair and equitable game for all teams. It felt like it was weighted in some way towards certain teams, and it showed. The semi-finals, all 4 teams in the semi-finals were teams that played all of their home games, all of their group games at home. They didn't have to travel. Did that play anything? I mean, injuries happen and players face fatigue. Are the players more fatigued, the ones which travel more? Most likely. So, yeah, I'm not against this format coming back in the future. And perhaps they've got to work it out better so that certain teams don't get all the advantages like they've had this tournament. But also, I think a little bit of common sense. We shouldn't be having games in Baku. I mean, I think, I can't remember, east of Syria, I think someone said.
Yeah, unless you host the tournament in Azerbaijan.
Oh yeah, that's completely equitable, but
that's the thing, isn't it?
You just can't have a tournament of this size and have games that far apart. There needs to be a little bit of common sense to say, okay, well, at least ping them around the Central European bloc. Why are we chucking in Turkey and all of them miles out of the way, in a sense? It just doesn't make sense, really. But yeah, I'm not opposed to this format coming back, but I think maybe not in COVID circumstances. I think that was a little bit of like, what are you doing? This doesn't make sense. But particularly for the who's getting all of the easy runs, I think I'd like to see that changed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, like you've both touched on it, it's not the fact that it's not the amount of travelling, but it's the variation in the number of miles travelled, like within groups. Like, so, for example, in group, let's pick a random group E, you've got Spain, who travelled no miles, and then you've got Poland, who travelled 5,876 miles. Like, how is that fair? Then, like, again, in Group D, for example, you've got England, who travelled no miles within their group, and then you've got Croatia, who've had to travel 3,694. As in, how is it fair that you've got a team that's travelling? It's not it's not the fact that the team who's had to travel 3,600 however many miles has had to travel that much. It's just that relative to some who've had to travel nothing at all, that's just it's just a little bit silly, I think.
Well, I don't really see why they split those games across such massive variables, in a sense.
No.
Like Wales had it in Baku and Rome. Those two places aren't even remotely close. Why not just put them all in Baku or all in Rome? At least then the travelling isn't such a big issue.
Well, yeah, and like, for example...
And then it's just down to the homes.
Yeah, I mean, you've got Group E, which was in Sevilla and St. Petersburg, and then you've got Group F, which was Munich and Budapest. Surely it would have made more sense to have Sevilla and Munich, sort of one side of Europe, and then St. Petersburg and Budapest, because they're the other side of Europe, aren't they? Would I be right in saying that?
Relatively so. I wouldn't say Munich and Sevilla are that close, but I get the point you're saying.
But what I mean is in
you're crossing
Sevilla
the entire
and Munich,
continent.
Yeah, yeah, you're literally going from one side of the continent to the other in both groups. But then for some random reason, in Group D, they've got London and Glasgow, which is like probably, about as close as it gets, really, when you look at all of them. So, bit of a weird one. But hey, I guess we'll have to appreciate this tournament for what it is. I'm sure if you spoke to, people from, English fans or Italian fans, they'll tell you that it's been quite nice to have played all of their games at home and then kind of, I was about to say travel to the final, but again, England haven't really had to travel anywhere. I mean, I guess their only game that hasn't been in England would have been their quarter-final game, right?
Yeah, against Ukraine.
Yeah, in Rome.
And where was that?
Rome.
Yeah, not exactly a big distance, is it?
No.
Here we are. Should we talk about routes to the final?
Let's do that.
Okay, so should we take a look at Italy first?
Okay.
I mean, perhaps before we talk specifically about their route, perhaps we could just say generally what our thoughts are on Italy in the tournament up to this point. I mean, as in they were going into the tournaments as dark horses. I think, Jack, to be fair to you, you said...
I called all of the shots at the beginning and they all came off. Ukraine, Italy, loving it.
Yeah, so you very much called Italy from the start. I mean, has it been what you expected, or do you think it's been better? Has it been worse? What are your thoughts on Italy generally?
Truth be told, they've been a solid defensive block. I'm glad that the defensive record stopped, because if it had continued, when it had happened against a bigger nation, it would have been one of those, how do they react, because it hadn't happened in so long. So I'm glad they got that away against a nation like Austria.
They've had their bad
Austria,
game.
But Austria aren't as big as Belgium or Spain, where perhaps, you never know what a player's psychology is when they concede for the first time in something like 10, 11 games. They might be like, how do we play now? So I'm glad that that's happened early in a sense for them. But by and large, they've sort of had... They haven't got individual players that have been great. They've got players who performed well in this tournament, but by and large, it's a cohesive unit. It's that defenders which love to make tackles and blocks. And, you know what I mean, they get a real high out of that. You've got a midfield which, by and large, hasn't been dominated or dictated by any other team. I mean, Spain came close, but I think still Italy were relatively comfortable. They didn't let very many opportunities through the middle. Everything had to go round them, really. And then their attack has been, surprisingly good. I know they haven't scored tons of goals, but they've always looked threatening throughout the tournament. And even in the group stage, they put 3 on, was it both Turkey and Switzerland?
Yeah.
I can't remember what the Switzerland score.
I think so.
So it's like they clearly can score goals if they want to. So they've been a decent team. In terms of negatives to their performance, I mean, the only negative I can think is the fact that Spinazzola's gotten injured in the knockouts, because he's been probably the player of the tournament or close to, depending how you rate that. But Italy have been solid team.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, you called it, to be fair. And, when you look at how France were playing, because I guess they would have been the bookies' favourites. I mean, if you look at how France were playing, they looked like a team of quality players, but not much sort of system, or I don't know. They just didn't seem to be able to build up any momentum. France, whereas Italy just feel like they're just ticking over. Not necessarily been banging in goals left, right, and centre, but they had their kind of wobbly game against Austria. But after that, they've kind of looked, when I say comfortable as you can be in an international tournament. So yeah, I mean, Dav, what are your thoughts on Italy up to this point?
They're a well-oiled machine, aren't they?
Yeah,
they're just that purring Ferrari, just strolling along, and I think it's fair to say, they were pushed against Spain. Spain outplayed them in the first half, but yet at the same time, I feel like even though they've played, they've beaten Belgium and Spain now. They've played some good teams. They've never really looked like overwhelmed.
No,
even when they were up against it, there was this kind of we've got this. I think we'll be all right. That kind of attitude they seem to have, which has obviously been instilled by Mancini after going 30 odd games unbeaten.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's as in, I guess that's a very good way of putting it. Actually, as in, like I said, they had their wobbly moments against Austria, didn't they? It was a tough game against Spain, but it was almost like, obviously Spain, the score was 1-1, and Spain had so much possession, but it was almost as if Italy were happy to go, if you want to have the ball, you can have the ball. That's fine with us. We'll just go to extra time and we'll see what happens. They at no point seem to have been flustered along the way.
And that's one of their strengths. That is one of their strengths, because definitely. They can do that, but then on the other hand, they can dominate the ball. They got Verratti, Jorginho in midfield who can dictate play, so they can do both. And I think that's what makes them.
That's the frightening thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that's what makes them, standouts for the tournament, really, because they have been able to blend that defensive solidity of old that the Italians are known for, while also they've got a little bit of flair, that
bit
goal.
Of spice.
Chiesa, he scored a couple of lovely goals. Insigne's goal against Belgium, that's up there. That's up there for goal of the tournament.
That's a good show. Yeah.
One of the contenders.
Truth be told, nothing's getting goal of the tournament over the Patrick Schick almost in his own half goal. I think.
Yarmolenko scored a screamer, didn't he?
Well, and Pogba did. I'm not saying it's the goal of the tournament, but a contender for it was a great goal. Yeah. So they've got quality. Strike, yeah. They've got quality there, and I think. They've got an all-round game. They've just got such a good system, like you said. They can swap players in, and they seem to know what they're doing. So, I think they've been very good, very impressive, and they've especially when you look at the side of the draw that they've had some tough games, and they've come through it well.
They're very much battle hardened, aren't they? As in, when you look at the teams they've had to play to get to the final, as in, it's not often that to get to a final of a tournament you have to knock out Belgium and Spain, and then you still have the final to play afterwards. And I think it's like you said, Dav, as in they seem to have managed that blend of talent and tactical awareness really well, which is, to be honest with you, the complete opposite of what France did. As in, if you go in purely on paper, no one should come close to France, but they just don't seem to have managed. They haven't managed to nail down their tactical approach. And just from a personal perspective, I think that the most scary thing about Italy, is kind of what Dav has said already, is the fact that, firstly, when they they concede or whatever, they don't seem to look flustered. Which is a sign of a very good side, and they just, it's almost like when you look at the talent they have, as in, perhaps it's not quite at the level of of what France have, or you could even argue not at the level of what England have in terms of depth. But they just seem to be able to tick over, and like I've said, they've got that bit of quality as shown by Insigne. So yeah, should we move on to the other side of the final?
Sure.
Or do we have any other thoughts on Italy?
I'd make one final comment, and that is whoever gets Donnarumma on a free transfer this summer has probably got the bargain of the transfer window.
I'm pretty sure he's PSG's man.
Well, that's not been confirmed, is
Fabrizio
it?
Romano has said, and he's a pretty good source.
Fair enough. It's not confirmed. I say that Depay's gone for free to Barca, and Wijnaldum's gone for free to PSG. So there's some bargains around this summer, aren't there? But one of those bargains will be Donnarumma.
For sure,
the keeper. He's only 22. He's a unit. He's so big.
6'6".
Yeah.
Absolute monster.
Yeah, he's a bit of a beast.
Maybe that'll come in useful in a penalty shootout in the final.
Well, that's a very good point. As in,
Jordan Pickford can't get across that goal.
Something you've got to consider when you get into this stage of the tournament is penalty shootouts. And again, Italy don't seem to have been flummoxed by that when they came up against Spain. They looked fairly confident. England haven't had to do a penalty shootout, have they?
No.
Not yet.
Will that be their woe?
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's obviously in some ways it's a good thing because it means that England haven't had to go to penalties. But equally, if there's the potential that they could go to extra time in the final, it's a little bit of you've not done it.
Harry Kane needs to practice his.
He does. Can't be getting away with tap-ins on a rebound all the time.
Jack, were you going to say something about Italy? I feel like you were about to...
It wasn't anything. I could have mentioned it when we talked about the final itself, but it was more so just sort of the comment of they don't concede. There's such a good defensive unit. Mancini, as much as he's changed the tactical nous of that team, they love to defend, and I think that's all. People always say defense wins championships, when attack wins games, and I think it's showing. They only concede. They haven't conceded more than one goal in a game yet. And I know England haven't either, but they've also not played the greatest of opposition. No disrespect, but they haven't.
Yeah, and, moving on to that then, like you're saying about the level of opposition, England have played Germany, Ukraine, Denmark. And Jack,
this isn't a good Germany. This is number 12 in the world Germany. I know you always got to take the world rank into a pinch of salt, because I think at one time Wales were in the top 5, I think, after the previous Euros. Let's just be real. Wales aren't a top 5 footballing nation. I don't think... No. I'm not... so that is what it is. But, this isn't a phenomenal Germany side. Usually, when you're looking for good Germany sides, it's the same year that Bayern Munich win the Champions League. That's a good indicator of if Germany's going to have a good tournament. And I don't know what stage they got to, but they didn't win it. That's all I know. I mean, it's not the Germany side that won the World Cup in 2014, is it? No, it's
as simple as that.
But the thing is, it is. A lot of those players are the same players.
Yeah, and perhaps that's part of the issue.
Yeah, that is the issue. Yeah, they've got some new blood. They've got guys like Sané, Gnabry. But I don't think they're working out. They're not Germans in a sense. They are fast, flary wingers. Germany's not about fast, flary wingers. They're about the working man. They run around like oxes. Got a good build on them. Not going to get pushed off the ball, and they're just going to physically dominate you and outrun you for the entire game. They proper work like a Volkswagen engine. You know what I mean? It doesn't stop.
I'm glad you can speak for the German man.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I'm loving these German analogies as well. Like they're like a Volkswagen engine. They're like a bratwurst sausage.
Yeah. Maybe not. Spongy. No.
Spongy, wow.
But yeah, not a great Germany side in general. They beat a Ukraine team, and as much as I was high on Ukraine, the Ukraine are ranked number 24 in the world. They were the lowest ranked team to make the knockouts. Somehow they beat Sweden. Not 100% sure how. But yeah, then they got absolutely hammered against England 4-0 in Rome, which was a bit of a disappointment because that was England's first game which it didn't really have the home advantage, and they played a Ukraine team which they were probably going to beat anyway, but a Ukraine team which obviously is stricken by COVID just like every other nation, so they're not going to get their fans out, and COVID as a consequence has completely crippled their economy, and they can't get loads of their fans out because they just can't afford to pay the money that the England fans are paying to come over either. So basically just another home game for England. And then they played a Denmark team, which to be fair was a good Denmark team. They played with a lot of spirit this tournament, and they're a solid outfit. And, you know, if it wasn't for a laser pen in Kasper Schmeichel, Kasper Schmeichel's eye, who knows? Who knows what could happen?
That's a saucy comment.
Yeah,
I mean, sorry, go on.
Well, I wasn't really getting much more to say, but yeah, just thought they've scraped past probably the hardest team they've had to face, but the hardest team they've had to face isn't as hard as Spain or Belgium.
No. I mean, that's a completely fair comment. I mean, there's no doubt that the routes that England have had to the final, and we said this at the start, didn't we? I think in the last podcast, I think it might have been Josh who said actually that basically whoever wins out of Germany and England have very much got the best chance of getting to the final on paper, obviously.
Especially after the Netherlands went out as well.
Yeah, exactly. Without being disrespectful to the other teams that were still in it, you know, like you said, Denmark were one of the standout teams of the tournament, especially given the circumstances that occurred in their first game. You know, is there an element to which, you know, because there seems to be this kind of verbalisation of, you know, England haven't played anyone good yet. I mean, do you think that's particularly fair on England, just purely from the point of view of, firstly, they can only play what's in front of them, and I guess, you know, secondly, at the end of the day, like, you know, like you said, Jack, Ukraine aren't necessarily vintage opposition, but ultimately they have got to the quarter-final. Denmark have got to the semi-finals, so they've earned the right to be there. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Dav? That sort of line of commentary, I guess, of, you know, they've had an easy route to the final, and, you know, they haven't had to play anyone good yet.
Yeah, well, you know, on paper, when you look at the world rankings, it is fair enough to say that the draw has been favourable for them, in the same way that it was when they got to the semi-final of the World Cup in 2018. You know, they beat Sweden, they beat Colombia. Like, the games that they had, they got to a semi-final, but, you know, they didn't play a big gun team, and the moment that you know, they did, they kind of came a bit unstuck. But at the same time, they beat what was in front of them, and I think, you know, we've got to try our best to be objective about that. Like, England have set up in a way that Gareth Southgate was confident would get them far in this tournament, and that's been proven. You know, they've dealt with everything in front of them. I think there were a few people who were getting a bit nervy after Scotland held them to a 0-0, but they've obviously addressed what needed to be addressed, and since then, you know, they've, well, in many respects, you could repeat a lot of what we've said about Italy. They've, you know, they are defensively solid, but then you could argue, have they really played a top class, you know, forward line? Probably not. Yeah. Because they played a Croatia team with an aging Modric and Perisic. They played a Germany team that basically had too many. You know, they had too many wingers. Don't have an out-and-out striker, do they? Yeah, you know, so you've got
Thomas Muller through the middle.
How do you put Muller, Werner, Gnabry, Havertz? Like, how do you fit them all in and do something? Well, the answer was what we saw. Not a lot, really. And, you know, for all you want to say about, you know, Denmark this week and the spirit that they fought with, Martin Braithwaite's only at Barcelona by accident, isn't he? Like, he's not a Barcelona player really.
Yeah.
So I just think they haven't really come up against a top class attack, and against Denmark we actually saw, well, when they're put under a bit of pressure, they did look at, certainly Pickford looked a little bit shaky. So I think that's what'll be interesting when you've got your Insignes, your Chiesas, your Immobiles running at them. How will they respond? Whereas you can say the Italian defence, they've dealt with De Bruyne and Lukaku. Against Spain, they dealt with Olmo had a good game. Pedri, yeah. So they've dealt with more. But that's not to say, after all of that England don't deserve to be where they are. Like, they've beaten what's in front of them. They've done it well. They played to their game plan. Gareth Southgate has to take a lot of credit for that.
100%.
And I don't think you can say they don't deserve to be there because of the way that the draw's gone for them a bit. You can say that, but then I suppose you make your own luck a little bit as well, don't you? So,
I mean, the thing with England is as well, and I'll in terms, like for Gareth Southgate, I am quite happy for him because I think he. And, I've said it here on this podcast, like I've said, I don't understand why he doesn't start Grealish and why he doesn't do that, etc. Like, the man is damned if he does, and he's damned if he doesn't. Like, as in, if he plays Phil Foden, you got people going, why isn't he playing Grealish? And then if he plays Grealish, you got people going, why isn't he playing Saka? And then, you got people going, why is he subbing Harry Kane off for Rashford? And then, you got people, I saw it today, people saying, Dominic Calvert-Lewin not in the squad again. He couldn't get a game if all of England's attack were out. As in, he's never going to win. But like you said, Dav, he's picked his philosophy. He's picked his side, and he's stuck with it. And it's worked out for him. So I'm happy for Southgate, in all honesty. But yeah, I mean, I guess it'll be interesting to see how it works out in the final itself then, I guess, as in when you look at how you've got an Italian side who have very much been through the ringer in the quarterfinals and the semi-finals, as in, when it gets a little bit squeaky bum time, they've got that kind of recent experience to kind of build off. Equally, England have got the kind of sort of confidence of having beaten or gotten to the final fairly comfortably. So yeah, it'll be a bit of swings and roundabouts, I think.
It'd be interesting to see.
Go on, Jack.
It'd be interesting to see if having the home crowd firstly will play an impact, and how easily Sterling can go down in the box. I mean, how many opportunities he's going to have against the Italians to go down that easy? Because to be fair to the Italians, when they do defend, they pretty much set up camp on the edge of the box, so they don't really play. You know what I mean? Not like
in the
you
box.
think of Ukraine and Denmark when they were defending. They were defending in the 6-yard area pretty much, and it was, this is where we're camping. But Italy will play firmly on the edge, and they won't give. They're really good at that. They won't give. So yeah, without those opportunities to get into the box and fall to the floor, it will be interesting to see how England manage to get a goal against the Italians.
Especially when you consider their togetherness. I don't know if you saw when they beat Belgium in the second half, they were 2-1 up, and Lukaku, it was like, how did he miss that? And Spinazzola got himself in the way of it, and he went out for a corner. And the centre backs were all over him like he'd scored a goal. Like, that's how much it means to the Italian defenders. So yeah, it certainly isn't going to be easy. And like you say, Jack, they know how to defend. So they'll be aware of all of the kind of tendencies of particular players, shall we say.
You don't win 33 straight games, and you don't go, something like 9 or 10 games without conceding, without knowing how to defend. They don't give away cheap free kicks and cheap penalties. They know what they're doing. It's not going to be such an easy ride for England this time.
Yeah, and I mean, going off from that then, I mean, like you've already said, Dave, you've got England's defence, which ultimately hasn't really been tested, has it? as in like, as you've said, Italy have already played against players like Morata, Pedri, De Bruyne, Hazard, Lukaku, as in like these are the top players, whereas ultimately really the only good attackers that England have played against are Germany, but with a very kind of lopsided attack where they're kind of playing Thomas Muller through the middle. And, like, let's not forget, Thomas Muller missed a sitter in that game. So,
yeah, that's true.
When I say missed a sitter, he was 1-on-1 and he put it wide, as in, like, that's never a good thing as a striker. And, I think there is the potential. They said I think they said yesterday how the way that Denmark were playing, they were kind of trying to get in behind Maguire, particularly because they kind of questioned his pace. And like if Denmark are kind of picking that weakness out, with the greatest respect to Denmark, as in Italy have got probably about 4 or 5 players who could exploit that, whereas Denmark probably only had 1 or 2, possibly.
What'll be interesting, I think, is whether the Italians stick with the high line they've been using throughout the tournament, because England...
What, defensively?
England, in all fairness to them, are a fast team. Saka and Sterling really can beat you for pace, but the Italians, it doesn't matter who they've played, have played pretty much around the centre circle. That's pretty much their line. They say that's... when they have got the ball, they don't all space out or anything. This is where we're gonna sit, and at the same time, they also don't try and stop the balls into the middle. All the passes seem to be directed into that sort of where you'd imagine number 10's going to be, and the Italians are happy for other teams to do that because they've got 3 midfielders there who they know are going to just harass and harass and harass, and if you get the ball in there, they're probably going to take it off of you. So it's almost like they're inviting people onto them, and they're playing such a high line that it's so tempting. So it would be interesting to see if, with England, they've got Mason Mount, who is particularly good number 10, and they've got speedy wingers, whether Italy do compensate in some way to accommodate for those factors.
Yeah, and I mean, like when you look at who Italy have played already, is in like, okay, you have got some quick players, but then, I don't think any of them are quite as pacey as like you say, as Sterling or Saka. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Italy adapt to that. And I think the midfield battle is going to be quite interesting as well. When you kind of look at, as Davis said, you've got Jorginho, Verratti, and who do they play as the third midfielder?
Barella, I think it is it?
Yeah, that's it. Barella. So, you've got a lot of quality in that midfield. Again, with the kind of... You've got individual quality matched with tactical nous. And look, let's be fair. I think for England, I think one of the key areas that Southgate has really kind of, not buckled on and kind of picked, these are my midfielders, is Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like Calvin Phillips is probably the one that's, at the start of the tournament, if you'd have said Calvin Phillips is going to play every single game, you'd have gone, really? Like, with the talent that they have. So, they are yet to really come up against a very good midfield. They have played very well, I think. As in they've... when you look at the midfields that England have had over the past years, I think this is probably one of the best combos they've had for a long, long time. So I think that battle in the midfield could be, particularly interesting. And in terms of how they lay out in terms of formation as well. If Italy are going to play 3 across the midfield and then England go for the kind of 2 defensive mid with Mason Mount, is Mason Mount going to have to do a good lot of tracking back? You'd assume so, because otherwise you're going to have Phillips and Declan Rice outnumbered, and then does that hinder in going forward? So, it could be quite an interesting one, I think. Are there any areas that you think Dav could be quite key?
I have got one I'll mention now, but just to say on that, I think that on the midfield, I think that's credit to Southgate, because for so many years that was the whole thing with England coaches, wasn't it?
100%.
You've got Lampard, you got Gerrard. You even had Scholes for a while, and it was this all: how do you fit them all in? How do you do it? And basically, nobody bit the bullet and said maybe we've got to drop one of these to make it work for England. You look at Gareth Southgate, and don't get me wrong, that's a very difficult decision who you're going to drop. But Gareth Southgate's gone.
Lampard.
You look at his bench, and you could.
Said with so much certainty. Apologies to any Chelsea fans who listen.
You can look at any I'll just let that pass. You can look at any you can look at the bench that Southgate's got, and you could easily say, well, Foden has won a Premier League. You could say, you've got so much quality and talent. Grealish, who would you rather have on the field to take a free kick? Do you want Grealish there? Or do you want Phillips? You could go through it and say on paper you'd have Foden and Sancho. He's just won the equivalent of the FA Cup in Germany. All these players who are sitting on the bench, these are our best players on paper. Get them on the pitch. But Southgate's gone, well, it's not about my best individual 11 players. It's about who the collective is. And you got to say that, to have a combination in midfield of Leeds and West Ham, and yet that's got them to a final. That's more than Lampard and Gerrard ever did. So,
100%.
and no one's going to say that Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice are individually better than either of those two players, but it's the system that the system that they were in, and so I think you've got to give Southgate credit on that. But I think an area that we haven't mentioned that I think would be really interesting as a battle I think will be the bench, because we've seen in this tournament you can have 5 subs. If it goes to extra time, six subs. 5 subs is essentially half your team, because you're not going to swap. You're not going to swap your goalie unless he's injured. So you can swap half your team. Well, you never know. Depends how he's getting on, isn't it? So you can swap half of the bench. Now, I think it's fair to say that England really gained the ascendancy against Denmark once they started using their bench. The quality they've got coming off it. Sancho, Rashford, Grealish, Foden, like any team in this tournament would take those kind of players because of what they bring, fresh legs as a standard before the individual quality they have. So that is a real advantage that they have. But then we've said Italy don't necessarily have the standout players that England have got. They don't have these big quality names and stars. They might not have won a lot of trophies. But we've all acknowledged through this tournament, whoever they bring off the bench, it doesn't really matter, really. They can come on and they can do a job. And so that's a really interesting battle of who's, like, because it's not a question of whose bench is better, because on paper you'd probably take England's bench. Yesterday they're bringing the captain of Liverpool off the bench to see the game out for extra time. Basically, Jordan Henderson's not in the starting 11, but he's coming off the bench with all that experience. He's won a Premier League, so you've got England's bench with all that has, but then you've got Italy's bench, and you think, well, there's not many names on that, but whoever comes on does a job, and I think that in itself will be a feature, because the game is going to be tight and nervy, and I think it'll be how the bench contributes to that might see it swing one way or another.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and it's like just briefly going off, like what you said about Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice, as in ultimately, he started with Phil Foden, and by the end of the tournament, he's plumped with Bukayo Saka, isn't he? So, he's very much gone for form, isn't he? Over a reputation. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word then.
I think he's realised that Kane needs pace either side of him. So whether that's Saka or then Sancho against Ukraine, Sterling's going to be playing down the left no matter what. He's recognised that, and you got to say fair play to him.
But again, equally, like you said about the bench, I think that is a key area. In terms of just pure talent, you probably would look at England as the favourites there. But it's almost like England have so much talent. It's difficult, isn't it? Because if he goes with the starting team that he's gone with for the past couple of games, you got players like you said, you got Sancho, you got Grealish, you got Foden, you got Marcus Rashford. You got all of these players who aren't coming close to starting. As in, like, how far do you go? Do you bring them all on? But then you're kind of losing that kind of cohesive structure, I guess. But it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Do we have any other key battles that we want to discuss?
Sort of talking, so just going to touch back to that midfield battle.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting that the way Verratti never ventures forward, he sort of sits as that anchor. So I think I wouldn't be surprised to see if it's almost like a V from both teams in a sense, the inverted V from England, where I don't think Rice and Phillips are going to move forward at all. I think they're going to stay there as linchpins.
Yes.
And I think Verratti's going to do the same. And I think it is just generally going to be head-to-heads all over the pitch, which will be interesting. I think what will be interesting to see is what Declan Rice can provide England. Because, I mean, I'm not going to shy away from this. I don't think he's been that good. I think he's scared of the ball. I don't think he wants the ball whenever England have the ball. I think he always tries to manoeuvre himself in a way that he is unpassable to. So he'll always make sure that there's a player between them, and he'll always put his hands in the air like, oh, pass to me. And it's like, yeah, mate, you've got to actually be in space or be passable too. And he's sort of, I think he's scared of getting the ball personally. So I think it'd be interesting to see, to be honest, great midfielder when it comes to defending. If you want a guy to win a tackle or track a man, great. He does not want the ball, though, and he does not want to play a pass. All of his passes will be sideways or backwards, and he doesn't want the ball. So it'd be interesting to see what Declan Rice comes to the final, because I don't think he's good enough. But I think, strangely, I never really see this as a big one, because I always think captains are chosen on experience. But when you saw Chiellini walk up to the referee and Jordi Alba walk up to the referee before that final penalty shootout in the semis, you knew instantly the Italians had won. He was excited to be there. He put the fear in Jordi Alba's eyes when he was smiling, jostling around with him, hugging him, looking really excited towards it. The Spanish looked a shell of themselves from that point on, because they knew the Italians wanted to be there and wanted it more. And I think, I mean, I don't know who the England captain is. I imagine it's Maguire, but I don't actually know.
That's Kane, isn't it?
Is it Kane? Oh, there we go. That's the thing, though. I think the captain sets the standard in terms of how that team performs. And you see Chiellini, how he interacts with Bonucci, Donnarumma. Donnarumma, a particularly young guy, you think, in that team. And they're all amped up for each other. He's amping them all up all the time, and they are a fierce team. Nobody wants to face them because they know they can't break him down. They're scared of him. When you see a guy like Harry Kane, by and large, hasn't scored very many goals I don't think he scored a goal that isn't a tap-in or a penalty. Well, actually saying that, I don't think he even scored the penalty. He had to score a tap-in off the penalty rebound. So I don't think Harry Kane portrays that confidence and ego which you need. I think Chiellini's been to enough of these big tournament matches, finals. He's won a few of them, and I think he knows what it takes to win them because of all that experience. I think that individual sort of, especially as he's going to be man-to-man with Kane for the entire game, I think he's going to set the standard, and I think that's why the Italians are going to win.
Yeah, I mean, when you have certain players that are captain on you, and they all have kind of different styles. I mean, like, when you look at someone like Steven Gerrard, for example, he wouldn't be... Well, for example, if you compare someone like Steven Gerrard to Roy Keane in terms of captaincy, Steven Gerrard was very much a kind of... you follow his lead based on how he's playing, whereas you have Roy Keane there. He's quite verbal, isn't he? He's giving instructions. He's telling players what to do. And that's not to say that Gerrard wasn't, but as in he was perhaps a quieter captain. I think Harry Kane probably falls under a similar sort of mould to Steven Gerrard. And I do kind of see what you're saying. Is in when you look at that England team, you kind of look around for the kind of leaders in the team, and you're probably down to, after that, Harry Maguire and then maybe Jordan Pickford.
Jordan Henderson as well, to an extent, if he's on the pitch.
Well, yeah, if he's on the pitch, yeah, it probably would be Jordan Henderson, absolutely. But as in, like, when you look through that, just at centre half, you've got Chiellini and Bonucci, and immediately that's filling you with confidence, isn't it? If one of those is your captain and the leadership that you've got there, perhaps that's doing the leaders in England's team a bit of a disservice. But I guess ultimately it's all it's a little bit more of an unknown with England because they haven't been in that kind of tricky situation yet where they're playing against a good team and they're behind, or they're going into the last 10 minutes needing a goal, or going into the last 10 minutes 1-0 up and needing to not concede. We haven't seen that from England yet. Whereas, okay, we may not necessarily see in those scenarios with Italy yet, but they're battle hardened in having played Belgium and Spain.
And to be fair, a Spain team which has a better midfield than England, so they already know how to do that, and a Belgium team that arguably has a close to as good attack than England.
Striker,
I mean, if you look at striker, it's better than England, but as an overall attack, it's probably about equal. So they've come up against teams with better midfielders and arguably better attacks and best of them both. So I think the Italians have it.
Yeah. Okay. So Jack, that's your thoughts on who is going to win. Dav, who are you saying?
I think that on balance, given the run that they've had, and I know that they're professionals, but you wonder how much of a difference would it make that Italy have an extra 24 hours to recover and be ready for it. I think that I would say the Italians just. Yeah, I don't think, because of the way that both teams set up, I don't think, and it's a final, so it's going to be tight, it's going to be edgy. It's not going to be like when Spain demolished Italy and beat them 4-0 in 2012. I don't think we're going to be in that scenario, but I think that on the balance of it, because there's being in front of your own fans comes with its own pressure. You can have the fans on your side, but you've got that pressure then to perform. So I'd go for Italy. Yeah. I'd go for Italy just, I think, on the balance of it all. But it certainly will be. It's a good final, isn't it? It'll be a tight one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting what you were saying about the fans there. That's kind of something that I was just thinking about, and I feel like Italy kind of strike me as the team who would kind of thrive off that sort of environment.
Underdogs.
Yeah, definitely. And like for England, okay, obviously it's going to be a big help having your home fans there, but ultimately, like when you think of where England have not done so well at international tournaments in the past, like the pressure from the fans and the media has been huge. So I feel like it could work for them and against them at the same time. It's a bit of a weird one. I mean, ultimately, I think I'd agree with you in terms of putting Italy as the favourites, just purely on who they've. And this is, I know this might sound unfair on England, but just purely in terms of who Italy have played. Like you said, Jack, arguably they've played a better midfield in Spain than England have. They've played a better, perhaps equally as good attack in Belgium. So they're battle hardened on theirs, and they've played as good as, if not slightly better than England in terms of individual quality. But yeah, as in ultimately, England for many, many years have probably had higher quality talent in like their midfield, for example, as individuals, but they've never got to a final. So who's to say they can't cause an upset? Well, I say an upset, that makes it sound like they're massive underdogs, but as in, I think most people would probably have Italy as favourites. I would think. Perhaps I'm wrong there. But yeah, I'm gonna back Italy, I think. So yeah. I think that brings us to the end of the podcast, guys. Yep. I think that brings us to the end. Our final podcast on the Euros. It's been good. I've enjoyed doing covering this tournament. There's been a lot of twists and turns along the way, and it's been good to chat about it with you both. Dav, thank you for joining us throughout.
Pleasure as always.
Thanks to Josh as well. Josh couldn't be here tonight, but we do appreciate him coming on for the past couple of Euros podcasts. If you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, why not give us a follow or a like? On the relative platforms. Perhaps listen to some of the other podcasts in the in the build up to the this final. Perhaps see if we had our predictions right. Perhaps there's some things that you disagree with. Who knows? As usual, we're on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, Pocket Casts, Anchor. Jack, pleasure as always.
Thank you.
And we shall speak to you all soon.